Hi, everyone, and welcome to Rituals of Strength, your source for power and for this week, freedom. I'm your host, Kevin Secours. We're going to be delving in today to the work of a very interesting gentleman by the name of Nikolai Berstein. He was a Soviet era neurophysiologist and biomechanist. His early books remain hugely influential in domains like motor research and motor behavior, and he is even accredited with influencing the creation of ecological psychology, which led to offshoots like ecological training and constraint-led training, which, as you know, if you listen, I'm a big fan of, and which has become increasingly popular, particularly in BJJ circles. But I feel it's very worthwhile to go back to the root, to the source, to understand the man himself and the context in which he was creating these ideas, and hopefully garner some new insights in how do we approach training and what we hold to be true in our beliefs. Now, to put it simply, Bernstein had a number of very important theories, but his most important, as I said earlier, was what he termed the degrees of freedom problem. So he believed that every single joint in our body had much more potential for movement than we usually require in an average movement. So if you think of how many things your finger joints can do, your wrist joint, your elbow, your shoulder, there's so many variables and combinations in which that can be put together. But in reaching to do something as simple as grabbing a glass, the majority of those options are not being selected. So Bernstein believed in order to have adaptability and in order to coordinate all of this variable potential, our body was always necessarily limiting what our choices were. And if that's how we perform in actuality, he believed the most effective way to acquire motor skill was to intentionally limit it, to control our degrees of freedom. Specifically in the earliest phases of learning, he believed in freezing our responses so that we could isolate and simplify. He believed, secondly, that as we grew our skill, our body, our nervous system would naturally unlock more movement potential as we gained newer and deeper insight. And ultimately, he believed it was the nervous system that was responsible for the efficient governing of all of these variables. Now, there are some valid criticisms against Bernstein that we're going to be taking a look at as well. But I think it's safe to say that Bernstein's research was a good 50 years ahead of its time. It's still not fully embraced across motor behavior research. There are people that are unfamiliar with it. We're going to be looking today at specifically at a book that I'm using here, which is Dexterity and Its Development. It's by Mark L. Laddish and Michael T. Turvey. And Dexterity and Its Development is 50% Bernstein's original text, which is called On Dexterity and Development. And then the second half are the authors taking a modern view of Bernstein's theories, exposing it to criticism and clarifying some areas. Like a lot of these books, guys, this one's a little bit pricey, sometimes 60 to 80 bucks, depending where you get it. But if you like today's podcast, I do strongly suggest you pick it up. I'm going to do my best to capture some of the flavor and quote Bernstein a lot, also to give you some of the historical context, but the book itself is amazing. I want to start off with a few quotes from Bernstein, from the man himself. I love these quotes. The first is, "Dexterity is a kind of currency for which all other currencies are readily traded. It's a trump suit that beats all other cards." And Bernstein goes into depth about talking about how dexterity and efficiency and coordinated movement can overcome speed, raw brute strength, and so many of these other components that we often attribute with athleticism and that we often seek out. He believes that dexterity was the ultimate skill that we could acquire, and that therefore it should be given the highest priority in our cultivation. He also said, "There is wisdom in dexterity. It's an accumulation of life experiences in the field of movement and actions. For this reason, dexterity frequently increases with age and is preserved into later years, more than any other psychophysical capacity." And I love this idea. If I can go back to that Kadashnikov quote about the martial arts, Kadashnikov famously said that martial arts should be a skill that's invisible until used and that cannot be taken away from an individual during their lifetime. And I like this idea about sort of untarnishable, impenetrable, intrinsic skill. And I think there is a wisdom for certain is something that grows with age, but movement wisdom is something that we don't often sort of associate together. And I really, really like that. And he said psychophysical, and he often, in a very Soviet manner, refers to dexterity as being not just physical, being psychophysical. He says specifically, dexterity is never purely a physical attribute. It's a psychophysical one because it is unique to each individual. There are records in speed, in strength, and in endurance, but no one has ever been able to invent a competition that would accurately provide champions and record holders in pure dexterity. And of course, we can measure agility and we could have some arbitrary dexterity competitions. But his point is that there's no one universal measure. I can say I can lift this much weight, and then you in the same lift, if you lift more, you win. But dexterity is far more intangible. It's far more sort of nebulous. That's part of the reason I think it's been so difficult to cultivate. But dexterity is deeply tied to this idea of adaptability. And as we'll see a little bit later, he believes it can only be acquired in variable, pressure-filled scenarios. He also says that dexterity is something that needs to be discovered, not built. And I love this phrase. Dexterity is something that needs to be discovered, not built. Although many of the Soviet researchers, and Western ones for that matter, are very empirical and look at the body as a machine, he really emphasizes the need for play and for discovery. And I think it's worth noting that his writing style is just so approachable, and he constantly says how he's making a conscious decision to try to make these theories more accessible to the widest possible audience. And he succeeds overwhelmingly. I mean, I knew his research, but this book really hammered home just how personable and confident he was in his theories. And I think that really comes across. One of the interesting ways that Berstein illustrates the degrees of freedom problem or potential is that he talks about simple machines. And simple machines generally have each of their parts doing one thing, a piston going up and down, something rotating. So in that sense, they only have 1 or 2 degrees of freedom as a machine, because each of those pieces might work in concert with another, but there's only so much potential for each part, often just one. At his time of writing, the most complex machines there were had up to 2 degrees of freedom. Now, as we read this in 2025, we know that there are machines that have as many as 50 degrees of freedom in the fields of robotics, and those are growing all the time. Think about that in just 50 years, going from a machine with 1 to 2 possible movements per piece, going up to something now that each component might have up to 50 variables. Now, as impressive as that is, that still pales in comparison for the current time with the human body. Human body has over 200 degrees of potential freedom, and that is, I mean, just pales in comparison to compared to something like an octopus. An octopus can be seen as the alpha degrees of freedom patron saint god, and octopuses have over 800 degrees of potential freedom. That being said, we are on the cusp of AI self-engineering itself, and I'm certain within most of your lifetimes you will probably see artificial mechanical machines that rival, if not exceed, human degrees of freedom. So, Berstein believed that when we speak about coordination in his words is precisely the overcoming of excessive degrees of freedom for every situation. And I think this is really interesting because when I really reflected a lot when I was rereading this book for the podcast, and I remember this being an initial aha moment for me. This idea that coordination always before was like a groove. The more repetitions you put in, the smoother that groove gets, the more coordinated you get. And that was a very antiquated, archaic notion for motor training. But he says that it's just the elimination of excess movement. And so it points to the value of even play, because in play, you learn what not to do. In play, because you have more variables, you learn all the things that are not that efficient. Because you're given the freedom to go outside of the lines, to color a little bit outside the lines, you more quickly eliminate what is not good. And so in Bernstein's view, because coordination is the overcoming of excessive degrees of freedom, we see how in his logic, play and free exploration will get rid of the do-nots much more quickly and will focus you down on the do's. So in that sense, I thought it was a very interesting perspective, because although I'm a huge fan of play and I believe in explorative learning and all the rest of it, I still found myself thinking of repetitions and kind of that antiquated, polished rut kind of mode. And this was, I remember the first time I read it, my first psychological emancipation from that, or certainly the first time I could make peace with, I believe in a repetition, but I believe in play. How can they both be true? He also notes that while the best mechanical machines can be defined, their efficiency is defined by not needing repair for long periods of time because they run smoothly. If you think of a good car is well machined, it doesn't need repair for a long period of time. But he said the human machine is quite different because it literally learns and adapts and improves as it goes. So not only is it seeking to avoid repair, it's seeking to repair itself and to improve itself. Now, this is a huge point, because oftentimes when I introduce the idea of degrees of freedom and this notion that we need to limit it, I get back some form of argument that says, well, isn't conventional learning already doing that? Because if you think of the classical martial arts training environment, the traditional dojo with everybody neatly lined up in rows, everybody performing repetitive movement, it would seem logical that that's very limiting, very constrained, and that certainly all of those students, their potential for movement is massively reduced. So would that therefore not solve the degrees of freedom problem? And certainly historically that has been the solution in most cases. But Bernstein was quite clear on this, and he said this is actually the opposite of how we should learn. The essence and objective of exercise, in his words, is to improve the movements. Therefore, it is to change the movement, because you can't improve the movement without changing it from its original state. And this is one of his most quoted quotes. Therefore, correct exercise is, in fact, a repetition without repetition. Now this, thinking this is the 1930s, this is mind-blowing that he's putting in this notion of non-repetitive repetition. He's encouraging this idea of exploration and play, and as we'll see, it's even more spectacular when we consider the environment in which he was doing this. He notes that a boxer or a fencer will practice with whatever, their foil, or practice on a punching bag, and he says no matter how crisp and no matter how fast and perfect those movements look, they can never really be termed dexterous or having dexterity, because they're being done passively. They're being done under ideal circumstances. The capacity to be dexterous can only be revealed, he says, during boxing or fencing when you have a real opponent, when each instant is full of the unexpected, and when being late by 100th of a second may well mean losing the match. That's a huge point. Here, he's not only pointing to the need for exploration, but he's pointing to the absolute necessity of alive training, having resistance and having a variability in the training. So that's a huge one, because that means that true dexterity, or we could say true adaptability, resides only in the domain of live training, of resistant-free training. Therefore, you cannot acquire these skills in static drilling. And of course, that's very consistent with everything else he believed. And then specifically, we said earlier that he believed in freezing the skills at the early phase. So his exact quotes, just to make sure it's not misunderstood, he said, one must concentrate one's whole attention and will on the quality of the movement outcomes, not only at the beginning of training a skill, but also at later stages when they perfect that skill. So in the early stages, naturally, we reduce and we simplify to make skill acquisition easier. In the middle, we explore and we become variable. But when we want to really hone and refine, we also then again need to simplify and reduce. And I love this quote. One must concentrate on the what's of the movement. The hows will come later by themselves. Focus on what you are trying to do. What is the end goal of the movement, of the exercise, of the combative technique, and how you will acquire it will come later by exploration. And that we can really see as being inspirational to ecological psychology and ecological training. This idea that I give you a task within limits, I don't even tell you what the approach is, and you need to explore to find out how. So earlier I said that these ideas were at least 50 years ahead of their time. I want to give you some context to show you just how incredible Berstein was. Because at the time he was writing, Pavlov, I'm sure you guys know Pavlovian theory, but he was a Russian researcher who famously would ring a bell and then feed dogs, and oftentimes starving them under very inhumane conditions. But by ringing the bell and feeding them, he created an association, what he termed a conditioned response, so he could get the dogs to the point where that the simple ringing of the bell would cause them to salivate. This was completely adopted in Stalinist Soviet Russia. This was the perfect synthesis of communist ideals. Everybody was a simple machine that was highly trainable through reward and punishment. And so to say that Pavlovian theory was dogma at the time of Berstein is a gross understatement. Berstein, when he came out with his research, had to necessarily specifically be an opponent of Pavlovian theory. And Pavlov was a senior contemporary of his, and he was quite respectful in all things. But it's interesting to note that he received huge public opposition. It was his ideas were seen as bourgeois and Western. They were seen as weakening the country, and eventually he became nothing less than a heretic. Pavlov, at the time Berstein finished his first master manuscript, Pavlov passed away. I believe it was in 1936. Berstein had just received his first proof for his book, and he felt there was no point in publishing it since the man he was arguing against had now passed and would no longer be able to rebut. So that's the kind of ethics Berstein had. He refused to publish the book in 1936, threw it into a drawer. It was widely thought to be lost, and it stayed there unread and untouched for 30 plus years until he enjoyed a resurgence in popularity in the 60s. Nevertheless, despite not publishing it, he continued to do his work. He was working at the Laboratory of Physiology of Movement at the Central Institute of Labor. He became formally declared a political enemy. He was viewed as being a heretic. He lost his funding in the lab and his position. He was furthermore banned from all publishing. He had no soapbox, no way of getting his message out. So naturally, he started to focus his attention on other avenues that were a little bit more acceptable. But for the remainder of his life, Berstein resided pretty much in obscurity. He stayed low, off the radar. It was the only reason he wasn't imprisoned for life or executed is because he was so cordial, and he just stopped in his formality any time he was getting too close to massively offending the institution. Had he published that book after Pavlov's death, had he continued to push the agenda, for certain he would have been eliminated. Now, what are some of the criticisms that we get from modern schools of thought? So one, that it is overall a gross oversimplification. Is specifically this freezing strategy, because some researchers show that freezing is often the initial strategy when learning a new skill, but certainly not always. There are always exceptions. Sometimes research has shown that learners will actually explore a multitude of things very, very quickly to eradicate them and then get down to what they want to do. So there is research showing that this fundamental freezing of initial action doesn't always occur. Learning is nonlinear. It's been clearly shown that lots of different people have lots of different approaches to acquiring a skill, specifically in motor behavior. So the linearity of Bernstein's approach is sometimes criticized as being overly simplistic. At faster speeds, if you think of blocking a sudden punch like a flinch, there may not be time for adaptability. And so there is likely a place somewhere in motor behavior for pre-programmed assumptive reflex. Not everything can be trained. Sometimes everybody is prone to flinching and getting surprised, for example. And mostly, and this is where ecological psychology is going to come into play, a major criticism is that Bernstein neglected the importance of environmental interaction. So I would say that ecological psychology, when they built on on his theory, they corrected this pretty cleanly, because they literally looked at the one thing that was missing and they made it the most important thing. The ecology, the environment, is what gives us, what demands, what motivates us to adapt. So in ecological psychology, or in the ecological approach, there are three fundamental fields. There is the environment we're performing in, there is the performer performing the task, and then there is the task that is being performed. The environment, the performer, and the task can all be individually be constrained. For example, you can play a basketball game in a half-court setting. That would be an environmental limitation. You could play with larger or lighter balls, massive balls, to work on, exaggerated passing techniques, weighted balls, etc. Anything to do with equipment would be environmental. You could limit the performers by saying you can only use your left hand. You could occlude their vision. You could reduce lighting. You could not allow them to talk. You could do anything you want to the individual. In martial training, I routinely gag, blindfold, make people hold their breath or mouthfuls of water. I put limitations that will emulate higher levels of stress to test our performance of a skill under those conditions. And then finally, you can limit the task. That could be something as simple as a basketball game with no dribblings, where everybody has to pass or shoot to work on teamwork and passing. It could be something in the martial arts like grappling only using the legs, grappling only using the hands, striking only using one side. So it can be the individual, the task, or the environment that can be limited. This simple fix, to me, not only corrects the oversights in Bernstein's approach, but it amplifies them. I think if he were alive today to see what's being done, I think his research certainly would have gone into that area. But what's most important for me is that I really, sometimes in teaching the ecological approach, the constraint-led approach, you get frustrated by the resistance. Sometimes it's a very subtle resistance in the student saying, I know you're good and I believe and I'm going to do it, but deep down inside they're doubting the approach. Sometimes it's institutional. I mean, if you're trying to do military or law enforcement training and you put down ecological concepts as a main drive, they're going to say, how do we measure it? How do we manage it? What are we funding? Well, how long is this going to take? It seems like new age wishy-washy stuff. So I tend to not put that stuff down on paper. I tend to give it different terms and talk generally about the structure, but try to give specifics where, more specifics on paper than may actually be occurring in reality. I think, in looking at Bernstein's approach, most of the high-level martial artists that I know, certainly in their own training, ultimately become quite intuitive and playful. But many of those same instructors stay attached to very traditional training modalities. Do it exactly this way. Why do we do it this way, Sifu? Because that's the way it's always been done. They have an unquestioning approach where they're just basically photocopying a bad photocopy in their teaching. I do, however, know lots of very traditional martial arts instructors, very high level, who evolve beyond the label of their style, and beyond the label of any necessarily specific epistemology. They use elements that are similar to ecological training, elements that are similar to games theory, elements that are similar to deliberate practice, and they might have read on it, they might have implemented research, but oftentimes they're just intuitively improving because they're in tune with their students and they're looking at what those students need. So I find it helpful to remember that Bernstein himself was surrounded by opposition. His holding these simple views wasn't just frowned upon or discouraged. They were criminally dangerous. They were legally consequential. They cost him his career, and he maintained them. He didn't necessarily stick up his neck to get cut off, his head cut off, but he maintained these beliefs until his dying day. He believed it was the better approach. His writings, when you go back to it, when you understand they were written in this Pavlovian dogmatic environment, they're so well argued and they're such a wake up call. And in many ways, sadly, they're just as required today as they were at the time of writing. I think what perhaps is the most striking about Bernstein, it's the sheer irony of his life, because while he was theorizing that purposeful inherent restriction of the body's potential was necessary for coordinated movement and skilled function, he would then himself become subject to almost the same kinds of constraints by society, by the society he was living in. He was being limited because of these beliefs that he was championing in the scientific community. So I think what is ultimately the most striking, the most ironic, and perhaps even the saddest aspect of Bernstein's entire being is that while professionally he was championing this notion that limitation and constraints are necessary to achieve the highest level of functional skill, while he was saying that limitation is a natural part of learning, he was ultimately expressing greater freedom. He was trying to encourage people to break off the shackles of traditional education and to go forward and to explore and to play and to embrace an entirely new and liberating method of training. But because of that same theory that he was championing, he ultimately became constrained and limited and censored and repressed and terminated by the same society he was seeking to help. His revolutionary ideas directly challenged dominant Pavlovian theory and the orthodoxy of Soviet science, who were looking at behavior as being linear, mechanistic, simple, and controllable through rewards and punishment. So Bernstein's intellectual freedom ironically became constrained because he was expressing freedom. And I think that's perhaps the saddest element. Who knows? Perhaps those constraints led to greater insight and revelation in his later years that we may never know. There doesn't seem to be any record of that. Um, perhaps, perhaps it took society that much time to catch up. I am simply thankful that that manuscript survived for those 3+ decades in that drawer and that it was republished, because honestly, this research, if not done by him, I don't know where we would be in motor behavior. It's that important. I think he had that large of an influence in the 60s and 70s that he laid the foundation for much of what we deem as commonplace today. We certainly wouldn't have the ecological approach or constraint-led education, and I wonder how evolved our teaching epistemologies would be in motor behavior. So, if you are looking for a great book, I'm going to recommend Dexterity in Its Development. The first half, I'll say honestly, Bernstein's portion is amazing. The second half is much more clinical, and ironically, it has the dryness that Bernstein was trying to avoid in the first half. I'll leave you with a few thought exercises. Stemming directly from Bernstein's work, I think it's advantageous to look at our own work, our own training, whether it's in the gym, if it's weights, if it's running, if it's martial arts. Look at things like a simple foot strike when running, or a movement like a bench press, or any technique that you perform in the martial arts, and start to look at all of the limitation that is required to perform that motion. Certainly, if we think of something like punching, a big part of that is getting rid of eroding, needless antagonistic motion. As I've often said, a lot of people punch like they're hitting the gas and the brake at the same time. They're contracting things that don't need to be contracted. And as Bernstein said, coordination, it's not the acquiring of something, it's the elimination of negative and needless movement, needless contraction, needless potential. So look in your own training, not about how to, a lot of my traditional work was about honing, refining, repeating, trying to put myself into a smaller and smaller, more precise slot, especially things like sword work and kata. But I wonder how much more liberating it would have been if I would have simply allowed myself to do those same katas in essence, the essence of the movements, the spirit of what it's supposed to be. And rather than making the block exactly having to be like this or a strike having to be specific, allowing variability. And through that exploration of variability, discovering that there are some things that just don't feel as good. And so I'm eliminating excess, but there are some variances that might feel just as good or even better, especially if you have things like limitations on mobility, or if you have chronic injuries, or if you're performing a motion that just doesn't match your body type. Sometimes giving yourself that variability, that freedom to explore, is enough. So I think the takeaway for me on Bernstein is the idea that we're not trying to perfect and polish a movement, but we're trying to find a solution that fits more circumstances by eliminating and exploring and eliminating lots of potential. So I cannot encourage you enough to just get out there and to explore. And then secondly, I would build off of the ecological school, because they have taken Bernstein's work into a more testable, measurable, achievable kind of domain. And look at how in anything you're doing, if it's a bench press, if it's walking in nature, any physical activity that you're doing, how can you modify yourself as the performer of the task? Can you inhibit your breath, stretch your breath, take fewer breaths in a minute? Can you work with, is it safe to close one eye or do the work blindfolded? Is it safe to, I don't know, if you're bench pressing, change your grip or modify the bench or whatever, something that modifies the performer. Secondly, modify the environment. Look at if you can use different tools, different instruments. If you're doing something, if you're walking in nature, change to boots instead of shoes, put a heavy backpack on. If you're dealing with weights, change the type of weight, the amount of weight, the repetitions you're doing. Super simple. Doing something as simple as bench press on the ground versus on a bench changes your appreciation, gives you new movement potential to explore and to play, and it will invite you to go places you might otherwise not go. And then finally, there is we have the environment, we have the performer, we have the task itself, right? So any task that you're doing, ask yourself, can it be modified? If I'm doing, let's say, round kicks in martial arts, I can cultivate the delivery of that. I can practice kicking with the shin, practice kicking with the instep, practice kicking with the ball of the foot. That will change the task. I can practice chambering very high with my knee before I fire the kick, or not chambering at all, or making it sequential and wave-like, or imagining the knee is injured and kicking almost with like a straight bar of a leg. So I can modify and modify and modify. And any of those things will now give new insight to what you're exploring. When Bernstein spoke about repetition without repetition, he was speaking really only to the needs of the body to explore variability. But if we talk pragmatically as school owners, trying to keep students interested, or as individual practitioners of any practice, any physical endeavor who are trying to maintain motivation, having repetition without repetition is one of the easiest ways to keep you motivated, because it keeps things interesting and it keeps you engaged. So check out Dexterity and its Development if you're interested. I also strongly suggest you check out my book Unconstrained, which is available worldwide on Amazon. I have simplified the ecological and constraint-led approach down to brass tacks. I give a really good, for idiots kind of intro to the history of epistemology and thought. And I think that's super important because it gets you thinking about how we learn, how you think we learn, how sometimes we have theories as individuals about how we learn, but it doesn't match how we're actually practicing. Other times it does, and we don't necessarily agree with our own theories because they're untested. Most people just think of training and getting their reps and needing to do it, but very few people dedicate constant or regular time to training how they train, to researching how they train, to testing how they train. So Unconstrained is a really simple read, really good blueprint. I strongly encourage you to check it out if you're interested. I want to thank you guys once again for the requests, and we had a lot of requests on Berstein and Degrees of Freedom. He has tremendous amounts of work available as well on PDF and articles. There's lots of YouTube videos about people reinterpreting his work, but I strongly suggest if you can get this book, go back to it, because although I was deep into it, I read this book some years ago, and now coming back to it, I had really deeper appreciation for what he was doing, for his humanity, for his humor. Very funny, and then to really understand the opposition that he was up against. I think any practitioner, any coach, any teacher is gonna relate to it and probably draw some inspiration from it. I know I did. All right, guys. Until next week, I wish you all of the strength and happiness. Stay safe, stay strong, and I look forward to seeing you next week.